Hello everyone, I am Asha Nayaswami. We're continuing with the essence of the Bhagavad Gita, explained by Paramahansa Yogananda as remembered by his disciple Swami Kriyananda. I've been working on a book about Swamiji, as you all probably know, and I just before I came, I was editing the chapter when he wrote this book. So I was feeling particularly involved in it. We had been through a lot of years of litigation with SRF about who owned various things, and it had all resolved so that Swami had no access to the original manuscript and no legal right to use any of the SRF magazine articles that had been published from Master's original manuscript. Not that Swami wanted to work from those magazine articles, because he remembered Master's writing very clearly, and he could tell that things had been changed and things had been left out, which is the editing process, but he didn't feel that the editing matched what he would have done. So he didn't know what he was going to do about it. A few years earlier, I think I've told these stories in other places, but a few years earlier, when Swamiji was really concerned about the Gita commentary, which he was all the way along, because it was one of the earliest assignments that Master gave him. Swamiji had been with Master, I believe, 1 month when Master left Mount Washington to go to the desert retreat to finish his commentary, to work on his commentary. And that was when Master said, "I asked Divine Mother who I should take with me, and your face popped up. Just to be sure, I asked her twice more, and your face popped up both times." I've always amused the way Swami tells that story, and Master told it to him. So Swami was just absolutely new, and Master took him out to the desert, and Swami tells all this in the path. Master finished dictating the commentary, and Master didn't have Swami with him while he finished dictating. He left Swami at the monks' retreat, and it was a long period of testing and trial for Swamiji. But when Master finished the commentary, he invited Swamiji over to work with him on editing it. And of course this was Swami's future more than his present. But he sat side by side with Master, and he said, I was just reading this a minute ago, and he said Master went over the manuscript with him sentence by sentence. I mean, it was a huge manuscript, and they sat side by side with Master right there, going over the manuscript sentence by sentence. And Swami was allowed to edit. We eventually saw the original manuscript, and there's notes in Swami's handwriting in the margin with certain suggestions. But Swami said his actual capacity to edit in the way that a disciple really would need to do was, of course, undeveloped, but it was way in the future. But then, of course, his separation from SRF, he lost access to the original manuscript. Then there was litigation over even the magazine articles, and in the end, it was determined that SRF had the copyright to those articles, so Swami really couldn't use them as the basis for his own book. And somewhere in the 90s, the exact date escapes me, Swami had a superconscious dream. And Master expressed satisfaction with what he was doing and told Swamiji to use my words. And we were still in the middle of litigation, and Swami said, and he knew he was talking about editing the Gita commentary. And Swami said to Master, "How can I use your words? I have no access to them." Meaning I can't get the manuscript. It was partially verbal and partially intuitive in this dream. And Master said to him, several things happened. Master said, "Something more is needed," and Swami said he knew it had to do with the heart. And Swami said he didn't know whether Master meant himself or all of Ananda. He didn't know whether it had to do with courage. Swami was also having heart difficulties at the time. And he said at the end of the dream, Master blessed him at the top of the head, and Swami felt all the energy coming into the heart. And he didn't know whether he was being healed although that later Swami continued to have heart difficulties, or whether that something was being filled in. But when he was lamenting to Master that he didn't have the manuscript, Master said, don't forget the possibility, don't overlook the possibility of a skylight. And that was how the dream ended, And so all these years later, which would have been now 2005, I believe, or 2006, whenever this book was written. I tend to think about when they were written, not when they were actually published, just because of the way I'm working. 2006 it was copyrighted, so it was 2006. Yes, 2006. Swamiji has moved to India. All the litigation is now finally settled, and he sits down and he decides he's not satisfied with SRF's version, or God Speaks to Arjuna. Swami said it was too scholarly. And he said Master's manuscript was very easy to read and very fun to read. And the way Mrinalini edited it, it became scholarly. And the information was there, but it was filled with footnotes in it. Swami just didn't feel it had the ease of spirit that characterized the original. So he said it was very hard for him to understand how, because when Master finished the manuscript, he declared to Swamiji, millions will find God through this book, not merely thousands, millions. I know, I have seen it. He said that's how Master declared it. So Swami's holding God Speaks to Arjuna, and he found it hard to understand how that book could have that kind of power. So this is in 2006, and he's thinking about this. So he decides, Swami's in his 80th year, and there had been this, I'm just telling you this whole chapter, I just edited. There had been this young man in India who came to Swami and told him that he had been walking in the forest in India, which it was his habit to do, when he heard a voice calling him, follow me. So the young man followed like this, and eventually the voice revealed itself as a person, and it was Babaji. And Babaji said, I am very pleased with Swami Kriyananda. I have extended his life. And Babaji also said, I'm very pleased with what he's doing, especially the television shows. And Swami at that time had recorded enough 365 television shows based on conversations with Yogananda, and he was appearing on Indian television twice every day, once in the morning and once in the evening. And it was those television shows that basically gave India knowledge of Master. And so it was, they were enormously important, because when Swami went to India when he was 77, when he was in 2003, his biggest question was, how is he going to reach people? Because when he was a young man, he traveled all over the country, but he just knew he couldn't. But when he got to India, he found something he hadn't known about, because it wasn't there when he'd been there 40 years before, which was dedicated spiritual channels on Indian television with millions of viewers. So Swamiji immediately saw the potential and started recording these shows. Within the first few months, he was on television every day. And so Babaji says to this man, I've extended Kriyananda's life, and I'm especially pleased with the television shows. Now, one is embarrassed to admit that one thinks of Babaji as living somewhere up in the Himalayas, and how would he know about television? He probably doesn't have one, but he probably didn't need one. It's just, the unexamined biases of one's mind get exposed every once in a while. Of course, Babaji knew about television, he knows about everything. But the end of that was, so here's Swamiji in 2006, and he's checking things off his list. He doesn't know, he's nearly died several times already, but this Gita is still not done. And so he decides, he said, perhaps Babaji has extended my life. He allowed the story to be told, which means he took it seriously, but he was being humble about it. But he said, for how long? He said, to work on that manuscript, he said, could take me a decade. and I'm already, I'll be 80 this year. Will I have 10 more years? So he decided he would write a short book, which he would call The Essence of the Bhagavad Gita. And instead of going stanza by stanza, he would give the essential message. And he thought, perhaps if I write a small book that's easy for people to read, they'll become so interested that then they will have the incentive to work their way through SRF's book. So he said for 2 weeks he tried to write it. And usually Swamiji has no blocks when he tries to write. When I lamented to him once that I was having writer's block, he said to me, I never have writer's block. Just like that. Oh, well, that's good. I used to. I don't anymore, but I used to. He said, I never have it. But he said for 2 weeks, I don't think he was blocked. He just put it more like he couldn't get into the book. He just couldn't get into any flow. And Jyotish and Devi were coming in 1 more week. It was like the 1st of October, and they were coming on the 7th, I think, for 3 weeks. And he said he knew that their presence would distract him from whatever little flow he had. And he said that was the incentive. And so for 1 week he worked very hard. And just before they arrived, he realized that he was not writing a small book, he was writing this one. And he realized that even though he didn't have Master's manuscript, he said he didn't remember it word by word, but he remembered every idea. When he looked at a stanza, he remembered every idea that Master had offered as the interpretation of the stanza, which was the real point. The point was that Master understood the scripture, and it was to put his ideas across that was the reason for doing it. So Swami realized that, of course, Master must have known what was coming. And he said that's why he had him sit there and they went over it sentence by sentence, because it was the skylight. It was superconscious intuition that Master told him was coming, that he was just going to be able to pull it through. Swami said, about writing this, he said, I always felt Master guiding me whenever I write, but he said, I really felt Master was working with me. He said, just as they had sat side by side. At that time, he felt like Master was just sitting next to him, working through him in order to bring into manifestation what Master knew was there. So how do you put together so many different parts? It was 55 years later that Swami actually wrote this book. He actually edited Master's commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. Even when the words are there, even if he'd had the manuscript, Swami talks about how a master communicates intuitively and he doesn't build rational bridges. He just perceives and puts words to his perception. But for people like the rest of us, for example, we need a little bit more of a logical flow. If we're capable of, only a few people are capable of reading something so succinct that we can just understand it, which is, of course, what Master did with the Gita itself, what one does with Patanjali, or Patanjali being the most cryptic, but just having that ability to look at those words and feel the intuition behind it. Anyway, so I was reading all of that. I was working on all of that today, which gave me a special appreciation of the book we're holding in our hands right now. After, when Swamiji, after he wrote this, whenever he had the opportunity to record, and he recorded 3 or 4 different times, series of programs for the internet primarily. One was supposed to be for television, but they all ended up on the internet. You'll find it, 108 programs about the Bhagavad Gita, 15-minute programs about the Bhagavad Gita, half-hour programs about the Bhagavad Gita. And Swamiji said, Master said that millions would find God through this book. And so Swamiji felt, of all the things that Master wrote, perhaps I said this last week, I have this feeling it sounds kind of familiar to me. But anyway, Master never said that about anything else that he wrote. And so Swamiji's commitment as a disciple was to do what he could to bring that, to facilitate the fulfillment of Master's prediction by in every way possible directing people to this book. it's in keeping with that, of course, that I've also taken it on. This is the 2.5 time that I've done, or the 2.25 time I've done it. I did it all the way through once as what they now call podcasts, which is what we used to call audio recordings. And I did about 18 webinars before I stopped, and now I'm on it again, partly just because it's the most fun book there is to do, but also in keeping with that. If Master saw it as being so central, just because I'm in this flow, right at the same time, I think it was about 2006. In fact, yes, exactly 2006. One of our friends in India, Mr. Kartikeyan, who's very highly placed in the Indian government and in Indian society, he arranged for Swami Kriyananda to meet the then President of India, Abdul Kalam, a very fine man. And because Abdul Kalam was interested in education, Swamiji took the opportunity to write a prospectus and then a guide to curriculum for what he called the Yoga Institute of Living Wisdom. And he said in that it was a whole curriculum. It was the roadmap for how Master's teachings can and will influence all of society. And one of the interesting things about that prospectus, speaking of the Gita, was that Swamiji said now that the commentary on the Gita exists, which is the book he had just finished, he said it's the hub of the wheel. And all of these, what he called Kriya Yoga in action, applied Kriya Yoga, now can be presented, because with the Gita commentary at the center, there's no danger that the spokes of the wheel will drift away from the center. That the Gita commentary describes the purpose of life completely, and then once that is solidly in place, all of these other aspects, education, child raising, science, philosophy, art, are all anchored. And they're all anchored in the Gita. It's just amazing how long the Gita has played that role, of course, ever since Krishna articulated it, but how many, many, many millennia this scripture has held this point of prime importance. We have no idea what's going on in this world, really none at all. And what we're here to do, and I will go to the verse in just a moment because it's right to the point. We're just here to break out of this delusion of the apparent reality of life and penetrate through it to the actual reality of life. And the Bhagavad Gita, the scripture, this commentary on the scripture, these are like they have an intellectual component. They have a marvelously satisfying intellectual component. The first time I met Swami Kriyananda, I recognized him before he spoke, as pole star for me is the simplest way I can put it. I just knew it before he spoke. I have a very intellectual mind, and especially then I was intensely dedicated to my intellect. I'm still dedicated to it, but I also have other interests now. But I felt his consciousness before he spoke, so what I felt was beyond intellect. And what magnetized me was beyond intellect. And then he spoke, he gave a talk, interestingly, except for the fact that somehow I figured out that he was a disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda, although in fact I may have known that before, so it may have been nothing he said. In fact, I did know that before, so it may not have come from what he said. Essentially, I have no idea what he said, absolutely none. Except that when he finished, I thought, this is the most intelligent man I have ever met. So Swami has always had, and he puts it into his writings, and I've always considered it like, thank you, God. It just has made the whole experience more fun. I presume I could have done it without it, but it's just made the whole experience easier, at least for me. So there's a huge intellectual component. Swami's writing is brilliant. If you ever try to write yourself, I can't, when I'm trying to write, sometimes I can't read his books because they're too good. And they just make me feel inadequate. I'm only half joking. Sometimes I really can't, because I just know that I can't rise to that, and I need to get comfortable with my own reality. So there is a powerful intellectual component, but what's happening here is a direct transmission of divine power, and a direct transmission of the Guru's power. And many, many times Swamiji has said that what really allows the spiritual path to actually work in our lives is not really what we think we're doing. It's the power of the Guru. Just as simple as that. I read a very simple phrase that I'd never actually heard before, that a Guru is required because otherwise the leap from here to the infinite is too big for us to make. It's just sort of a simple way to put it. It's like we can step as far as the Guru, and then the Guru will carry us the rest of the way. But we're just not big enough to make that step all at once. We need that transmission. But what's really given to us is power. And the concept of power can be misused, but it's one of the 8 manifestations of God is power, because it takes power to break out of delusion. You can't break out of delusion just with thought and affirmation. It's just not enough. There has to be, Maya is a force. Satan is a force. And there has to be a counterforce. And that counterforce is not intelligence. It's not intellectual thought. It's an actual power of perception which the Guru puts into us. That's what it is to receive. That's what St. John says. To all those who received him, to them gave he the power to become the sons of God. It's very interesting. That's the word. Swami talks about it many, many times. He talks about Master as an actual power. And these are things, again, that I can say and I can think about, and I enjoy thinking about them. But when you finally feel it, it's entirely different. It's an intuitive understanding that the words basically push you to the door of that understanding, but something else pulls you through it. So both are necessary. And sometimes people are disinclined to think and disinclined to try to be clear-minded. Swamiji never supported that, because it's not like any part of us that's good becomes less. It's that every part of us becomes infinite. That's what I understood about Swamiji. The intellect was not a problem. The intellect is only a problem if it's not balanced by every other positive quality. But if one has that kind of inclination, eventually we have to become clear-minded. There's Jnana yogis and Bhakti yogis and Karma yogis and Raja yogis. We get there lots of different ways, but in the end we all end up in the same place, where everything is in line. It's thrilling. That's the only word I can say. Absolutely. Now, okay, we are at chapter 2, verse number 52, and we're still in the nature of right action. And since I'm moving at a snail's pace, we're probably going to be here for a while. I'm going to tell you a joke. There's a joke where there's a snail and he's riding on the back of a turtle, and the snail is saying, "Whee!" So, I'm not really the turtle. I love that. All right. So, we're moving at a snail's pace, and we're on 252. We're moving at a snail's pace because I'm so fascinated by every word in these stanzas. When your perception pierces the dark mists of delusion, you will become indifferent to everything you have heard about this world and the next. Oh, I love it. Of course, it's just English, and this wasn't even, Swami retranslated the Gita too, which is why it's so interesting now. And so he starts with when your perception, and this is what, the word perception, this is what direct perception, is what spiritual understanding is all about. The difference between revelation and religion is a really important point. The masters have a direct revelation of reality. They see what is, because they are not hindered by the dark mist of delusion. They just perceive reality. But once they have that revelation to begin to bring it down and to put it into words. Swamiji, when he was 18 years old, had a direct revelation about meaning in the arts. And he was a college student at the time, and he was already an aspiring writer. After that revelation, he destroyed everything that he had written. And he wrote two things at that point. The allegory for what was man-made, which became Land of Golden Sunshine. I believe the story, The Singer and the Nightingale. For a moment I doubt myself, but I believe that's what he wrote. Both of which he refined through his entire life and remain in his body of work. But his revelation was that you could tell the greatness of a piece of art by the quality of the light that emanated from it. And then he talked about Homer. Homer's works all emanated a bright white light. Shakespeare's works were bright, but not as bright as Homer's. Chaucer's light was kind of muddy. And so for his English class in college, he wrote his criteria for greatness in art, and the professor flunked him. It was just too crazy as far as the professor was concerned. But as Swami said, he knew he was right. Swami wrote that revelation 7 times. And it was like 2005 or 4, somewhere right in there, when he finally wrote Crystal Clarity in the Arts, A Guide to Self-Realization, I think is that what he called it. But he wrote it 7 times. And 3 or 5 of them were published at Ananda. 2 of them, I'm counting as 1, the flunking grade he got for his college essay. And 2 was when he wrote it in 1962, just when he was living with his parents. It was never published. The other 5 were all published by Ananda. But he just kept trying to put into words what he knew intuitively, and it took him that long. It took him decades and 7 attempts before he came close enough to saying what he knew. You know, Master's poem, Samadhi, is unique in the annals of spiritual literature because Master was in the state of Samadhi and simultaneously wrote a poem. Ramakrishna would move into those Samadhi states and he would try to keep describing it. But at a certain point he would lose the capacity to describe it. And in the extraordinary Leela of his life, you have these scenes where he keeps trying to do it. Now, that comment about Samadhi and the way it was written, that was something Swamiji said. I wouldn't have known how to evaluate that myself. But that's what Master said. He said he was in Samadhi riding on the New York subway. And he wrote the poem there. And he said, I rode back and forth on the subway line. And no one even saw me, he said. But I think he made himself invisible. So when we say, when your perception pierces the dark mists of delusion, what's happening is you're suddenly seeing the world for what it really is. I mean, all of us, the most wonderful things about the highest spiritual truth is that it can always be brought down to something that we have already experienced. Sister Gyanamata said that you should anchor your spiritual life on what you unequivocally know. And sometimes at different points in my many years on the path, when I've gotten myself extremely confused, which unfortunately happens, and if you just don't quit, the mist will clear. But I've really realized that I have to reduce things down to something that I absolutely know, so that I have a point of unshakable faith. You know, I may not have faith in my ability to realize God, to become free in this lifetime, to become a Jivan Mukta. I don't have any faith in any of those things. I mean, sure, why not? If God has that in mind for me, that's no problem. The bottom line that I stand on is that I'm absolutely sincere in my spiritual life. It's just, this is real to me. This is not pretense. This is who I am. And of course, a great deal can follow from that. And I don't have to be good, therefore. Being good at it is extra. But there's a place I can stand that nothing can ever take away from me. And that's what we really have to have on the spiritual path. I always tell people, you back up to the point where you're very, very secure. And it's not going to be nothing. Because if you're even thinking like this, you've got something. The word sincerity came to me from Swamiji many years ago, and in some context, there's two incidents that have become slightly confused in my mind, but the essence of it is there regardless. What I believe happened, well, there were two, but what I believe happened when he gave me this one was that he was passing out compliments, which he didn't do very often because he never flattered people, and he was very careful. Because you know, if he starts passing out compliments, you're going to spend all your time trying to get one. And that's not really a very wholesome relationship to be in with yourself or with him. But somehow or another, he was passing out a few compliments, and I didn't get one. And I wanted one, and I think he perceived it. So he said, well, Asha, you're very sincere. Which plunged me into a very sad mood. And I stayed in the sad mood for a little while, days, I mean. Until somehow or another, Swami asked me, or I brought it up to him, and I basically said, damning with faint praise, because that's how I felt. You know, it was like he had to scrape the bottom of the barrel to say something good about me, because I put myself out there, and, you know, he didn't have a choice, but he was too honest, you know, to give me any more hope than that. But he was shocked when I responded like that. And I remember the way he spoke it and the way he looked at me. He said, Asha, sincerity is everything, like that. Which, you know, I've cherished that ever since. I felt like that's true, especially given my particular temperament, or the way my temperament was. Thank you, God, I've changed, but always a little uncertain and a little nervous about whether I was doing it right, whether I would ever get it right. Writer's block, you know, that sort of thing. So I don't have to be good. I just have to be sincere, because sincerity is everything. Because if you're sincere, sooner or later you'll get it right. Because you really want to get it right. I'm not doing this for show. I'm doing this because this is who I am, and that I know. So now, where were we coming to this? We're talking about perception, and we're talking about piercing through, you know, this mist of delusion, and just finding the direct point. That was what I want, just finding the point where I can really stand. What do I actually know? And, you know, the fact of the matter is, by the time we know anything, really, we're a long ways. We're much closer to the end than the beginning. I often think of it in terms of delusion is finite, bliss is infinite. Even if I have an almost infinite number of mistakes still to make, it's a finite number. And I'll just chip them away one by one. And the day will come when it'll be the last one. And so our direct perception of reality that we can hold on to, that's not ego-based and not an affirmation. And then it says you become indifferent to everything you have heard about this world and the next. Direct perception makes you strong. And you're not affected so much anymore by all the other things. Worry about money, worry about who loves me and who doesn't, worry about disappointment. Swami was asked a simple question once. How do you know when you've passed a spiritual test? He says, when you're no longer afraid of it. And even in a bigger way on the spiritual path, like, how do you know, when you're not so bound by karma anymore? Well, you're not afraid of it. I asked Swami the question in a slightly different way. How do you know when you still have karma to work out? And he says, when you're still afraid of it. When you're still afraid of being hurt or left behind or failing or whatever it is. I mean, then there's karma there. But when you become indifferent, and indifferent is a marvelous word because you're not negative. You're not repudiating it. You're not repelled by it. You're just indifferent to it. It doesn't mean anything to you anymore. That's what you are. You're indifferent. You're indifferent to public opinion. Swamiji was indifferent to people's opinions about him. He just didn't care. We had a huge community meeting once. This again was many years ago. These are all things that I've been writing for the last year. And it was a lot of controversy in the community. It's not even worth talking about. But Swami was the subject of this big discussion we had, and we recorded the discussion and we sent it to him. And Swami said, I was so unconcerned about what people thought. He said, I listened to the tape for the first time, sitting with two men I hardly knew. One of whom was the leader of the SRF group in Munich, Germany, he said. And it was just like, but he didn't care. He was indifferent to it. He was neither trying to impress nor protect. What difference did it make? It's a wonderful word. And it's a wonderful word to think about. Direct revelation, direct perception, pierces the mist of delusion. And then we become indifferent to the conditions of the world because we're living in something else. We're just living in this picture of reality. I know who I am. I know why I'm here. That doesn't mean we don't suffer still from the ups and downs of Maya. But it's to be riding the waves from an inner place is quite different than to be tossed about on them. Last Sunday, when I was giving Sunday service, I was talking about this. There's a tree in our community in Palo Alto, this huge elm. And it sits in one place in the community, but its branches extend so far. You'll see a branch way over here, and you'll realize, it goes all the way back to this tree. It's the mother tree of the whole place in the communities that apparently trees have. But what's interesting to me, you see, at the farthest reaches of the branches of that tree, there's a little tiny bud, and the little tiny bud is opening up into a little leaf, which means that the entire life force of the tree, which is in this huge trunk and these, God knows how far and deep the roots go, but the entire life force is all the way out there. Because if it wasn't, that little tiny bud wouldn't be able to open up and become a leaf. So that's the way great masters live in this world. They are this enormous power at the center. But because of that, they can extend all the way out. They don't have to hold themselves in. They go all the way out to the tiniest little leaf, which is really you and me. It's so remarkable how the masters talk to us. And they talk to everybody. When Swamiji asked me, he started writing this book at one point, Miracles and Answered Prayers. He just decided he would write it. He decided the world needed it, which it does, desperately needs confirmation of a higher power. He started writing it and then gave it to me to write. He just brought it to me one day and said, you write this. It was one of his very skillful maneuvers to work with my nature and to get me writing again, because after I wrote the book about him, I'd stopped. So I wrote it, but it was also, oh my goodness, it was from my heart, for the benefit of my heart, because I had to interview people, I had to get stories. And I worked almost entirely within the Ananda family, but I traveled to various of the centers and made appointments, and people came and talked to me, and I can type pretty fast. And even though the spelling is atrocious, I can still read it afterwards. So I can just sit there as I am, looking direct like this and type. So someone could talk to me and I could maintain eye contact and still take notes, which was a great help. And so I would just look into the eyes of all these different people, young, old, crisp, clean looking, worn out, smooth, those who'd had a smooth ride, and those who had really been dragged through the bushes. And each one of them would tell me how God had touched their life. And all of what I would call the rest of it, because here's the eyes and then here's all the rest of it. All the rest of it just became nothing. It was just the soul coming through the eyes. Swamiji actually said he never looks at anyone's eyes, he looks through them. He looks through their eyes to the soul. He literally didn't know what color people's eyes were. People he was with for years, he didn't know what color their eyes were because he never saw it. He just saw the soul energy coming through. So when I had the extraordinary opportunity to have people tell me how God had touched their lives, I realized that the total life force of the tree extends all the way out to the tiniest branch. Because here were people who were not notable. They're not going to get even a footnote, in the history books. And they're just devotees, sincere devotees. But God gave them all his total attention. And took their little bud, our little bud, and opened it up into a leaf. Extraordinary, And when you're living in that, the fact that all of this is happening around you, what difference does it make? I mean, I wish we could keep that thought all the time, but we really, in meditation, in prayer, in introspection, in conversation, just keep it. When we're gone, we're gone. When somebody was trying to get Ananda to support an anti-war, anti-nuclear initiative, this was decades ago, big movement in California, very sincere and good, because all of these things move consciousness forward. But their method was trying to scare people. And so they had these horrific presentation about a nuclear bomb on Chicago and how many people are vaporized and how many people will turn to ash and how many people will, die in the next week. I mean, it just went on and on. So they presented it all, and it was impressive and very well done. Afterwards, Swamiji said, his first response was, in 100 years, almost no one on the planet now will still be here. And whether we dribble out over the next century or all go to the astral world in one big movement, he said, once we're there, it doesn't matter at all. I mean, just such a different perspective. Then he supported them, but then said, it's hard to achieve a good end if the method is fear. So it was complicated. But the point being, when we perceive, we become indifferent to all those things. It just doesn't matter. And as we go through, and I'll move on now, this whole section, what is it to be firmly rooted in the inner self? And then what does that look like? What does that feel like? So in number 253, Krishna says, when your discrimination is no longer tossed about by opinions, but abides unshaken in soul bliss, then you will attain final union with God. I love that the English is so direct. When your discrimination is no longer tossed about by opinions, and he doesn't say whose opinions, whether it's somebody outside trying to persuade you or somebody inside trying to persuade you. Discrimination is the capacity to use your willpower to perceive different states of consciousness. And so it's not just intellect, it's because it takes more than intellect to do it. You have to use willpower because Maya is a specific force. Maya will try to persuade you that what you want is also what God wants. What a surprise. I meditated on it and God wants just what I want. What a surprise. Isn't that convenient? It's just like you have to be a little bit suspicious. It's not that God doesn't want what you want, but when all your intuitions coincide perfectly with your desires, it's a good idea to at least step back for a moment and try to test it in some other way. But our discrimination is using our willpower to discern different states of consciousness. See, the problem with intuition, the problem with the inner voice, is that we are a multiplicity of vibrations. We are capable of living on a purely superconscious vibration, but most of us have riches in our chakras, which create a lot of magnetism for other things. Longing, desire, resentment, disappointment. I'm amazed. I'm truly amazed by how often I can be ambushed by some wound in my heart. Some conscious wound from this lifetime that I know where it comes from, or or just some abstract feeling of incompleteness. I mean, this is the whole driving force on the spiritual path. We sense that we are incomplete. We sense that we are confined and defined by less than we are, and we're motivated to move. And I'm impressed by how these little vrittis ambush us. Discrimination is using your willpower to extract yourself from those vrittis because they feel really comfortable. So the fact that something feels really right, words are very hard. It can feel really right because it's so in tune with our present level of consciousness, or it's so in tune with our subconscious level that we just feel really at home there. This is so familiar, and that makes it feel right. But discrimination is to be able to use our willpower to discern among different levels of consciousness, to know where that feeling is coming from and what it really is. I remember a man who came to Swami ostensibly for guidance. I don't know whether Swami would sometimes keep me in the room and he would talk to people so that I would learn things. And sometimes he would just tell me afterwards, this is a memory from so long ago, I've lost track of whether I was actually in the room or not. I have a picture in my mind of the man's face, which makes me think I must have been in the room. It's irrelevant except for me and my little exercise in memory since I use it so much. But this man was pleading with Swamiji to support him in a certain life direction that he wanted to take. And he kept saying, it feels so right to me. And Swami did his best to guide the man away from it, but he was too committed and followed that, and in fact it took him off the path, took him off our path. But I said later, Swamiji, I think the reason it felt so right to him is because he had closed himself in and there was nobody inside of him but him. And so there was nothing to contradict his commitment to this particular course of action. Swamiji allowed me essentially to test my ideas on him. And he trained my intuition by correcting me pretty continuously. But I had the opportunity often to just say, what do you think? Is this right? So Swami agreed that was exactly what had happened. And merely because the man had actually come all the way to Swami to ask his point of view didn't mean that he was actually open to his point of view. He came to get Swami to confirm what he already planned to do anyway. But that's just a little something to be conscious about. The mere fact that it feels so right may or may not be the final word. Of course, intuition is an entire subject on its own. But discrimination requires willpower. I remember in a certain circumstance that I was in once. By no means am I good at this because, as Swami told me, I have lots of intuition, but I also have a lot of emotion. Less than I used to, but I have a lot, and I can't always tell the difference. Things do feel right to me for lots of the wrong reasons. But I've learned that when I am not quite sure what to do, often it's better to do nothing. That's my particular problem, is not lack of initiative. So for me, it's better to pause. Some people need to get energy moving regardless. Me, I need to pause. But I realized that when I'm being driven by a wrong impulse, I feel a compulsion to act. And that very compulsion to act has become a sign for me that I'm not indifferent. I'm not using my discrimination. And so the using discrimination as using your willpower to discern different states of consciousness often means to actually hold myself still, hold my thoughts still, hold my actions still. In my case, close my mouth. Nowadays it means don't write the email. Just don't do it. But it takes so much willpower sometimes to really lift yourself out of the vortex created by all those vrittis so that you can actually discriminate between different states of consciousness. It takes a tremendous amount of willpower to be able to do it. But once you begin to understand the tremendous benefit of doing it, it becomes less difficult, because a great deal of difficulty is just an aversion to putting out the energy. It's just as simple as that. You know, in this book that I'm writing, what I've learned really simply is that it's not hard to write well as long as you just keep working at it. You just keep putting out the energy. And at a certain point in my own process of gaining confidence in what Swami always had confidence in, that I could write, but I've had to learn, is I finally figured out all it is a matter of putting out energy. I learned this when I had to do a home repair project that I was really terrible at, which was hanging curtain rods, which for some reason or another I decided I would do myself, which I'm not good with tools. And I'm really not good with home repair. So I had to do this very complicated project of hanging these curtain rods, which involves a lot of different steps. And I learned things like you can just take it down and fill the holes in the wall with spackle and then repaint. I mean, you know, there's always a solution. And I came up with a motto, which has served me very well. You know, it's called the patient application of willpower. And I came to realize from trying to put up curtain rods, which is extremely unimportant to my sense of self-worth. Writing, however, was extremely central to my sense of self-worth, but they were the same project. It was the patient application of willpower. And once I understood that, in fact, I can do that I'm not afraid of putting out energy, and I'm actually not afraid of sticking with it, and I'm not afraid of having to do it over, as long as I overcome my aversion to that being the process. You know, and just accept this is how it happens. Swami worked so hard at his writing. He would often say, I must not be a very good writer. It takes me so long to do it. I think I'm finished, and then I come back and I have to write it all over again. I mean, he said a lot of those things in my hearing so that I wouldn't feel like such a chump when the same thing has happened to me. But his commitment was to continue until superconscious intuition was satisfied. You know, he used his discrimination to discern between different states of consciousness, whether subconscious is speaking, conscious is speaking, or superconscious is speaking. And I was starting to say about intuition is that intuition actually comes on many levels. So we have to actually make a distinction, because you can really act according to your own inner voice, but it might be a subconscious voice, because it is one of your inner voices. The problem is there's a lot of you in there. And so that's being tossed about by opinions, you see. Because opinions are not reality. Opinions are not those things that will move us towards superconsciousness. They could be facts. See, that's what's confusing. They could be factual, but they're not truth. Truth is what takes us to superconsciousness. So not to be tossed about by opinions means that we're not even interested in our own opinions. Merely the fact that I feel this way needs to be noted, because as Swami repeatedly says, it does nothing, it serves us not at all to suppress. After the community burned down in 1976, which of course now was an eon ago, and many of you listening weren't even born. It's very hard. It's hard to be in a position where your own life is history. But I am in that position now, and I love being older, but it's amusing. Aspects of it are amusing. So in 1976, this whole community burned down. It burned down in an afternoon, and it was an experience. The whole community, I say, was mostly where what is known as the Nanda village now. Ayodhya and meditation retreat weren't, but a lot of this burned. A lot of people lost their houses, and everything went to ash. It was stunning. Fire is really impressive, really impressive. And Divine Mother is really impressive. That fire, and I was in an earthquake, what was called the Loma Prieta earthquake in Palo Alto, the Bay Area, in 1989, which was also a while ago. But in the 30 seconds or so when the earthquake was going on, and the building was shaking, and the mind works in a really funny way. I did not say, Om Guru, whatever you want. That was not my immediate reaction. I'm embarrassed to say, but that was it. I have to be honest. My immediate reaction was, this building is shaking. I need to get out of it. But my perception was that the building was shaking. So I ran out of the building into the central courtyard, because that's the way the apartment I was in, it was just a few steps to the outside. But oh my gosh, the earth was shaking and the trees were bending and the water was coming out of the swimming pool like a tidal wave over the fence. It was short, but it was impressive. And it was so startling to realize. And the second that occurred to me just right in the middle of all of that was the phrase, earthquake proof is oxymoronic. There is no such thing. If the earth wants to take it down, she will take it down. It's just a question of degree. And, when the fire came through and just in a matter of hours, we were standing up on what is actually standing up right where the building, I'm right now in Ananda Village in Rajasi Ridge in a building, and we were right here up on what they call Sunset Meadow, standing next to Jyotish watching this fire come up the hill. And you think it's not going to happen to you. I said, Jyotish, it looks like it's going to burn Ananda down. And he said to me, yes, it looks like it's going to. I mean, we weren't quite that chipper, but it was more like, wow, this is actually going to happen. And in fact, it did. And we were up there scratching this little fire line. We were so sincere, just doing this, our little thing. And the fire came and first thing it did, just jumped across the road, completely ignoring all our efforts. And then it shot over to this area where a lot of our houses were, which was heavily forested. There'd been 7 years of drought and everything was like tinder. The fire hit the base of a very tall pine tree. I mean, I can vividly see this. Faster than you can even think about it. The fire shot up this pine tree. This tree was, like I would say, like a 3-story building. It was really high. It shot straight up the tree and started doing what they call tree topping, which is lighting all the trees next to it. And that was the moment when we just started trying to save stuff. We were going down and there was nothing we could do about it. It was very exciting. And, but afterwards, this was the whole point of where I was going. When Swami was in Hawaii working on the path, and he flew back the next day. But he got us all together, and he was very affirmative, about how we were going to go forward. But he also said, just straightforward, this was a trauma. He said, it was a trauma, and there's just no point in saying that it wasn't. And this will traumatize us for a long time, especially people who lost everything. But all of us were traumatized, even if we didn't lose anything, because my, there's no security at all in this world. In a split second, poof, gone. The earthquake, the fire, at least we saw it coming. The earthquake was like, 1 second before it started, it wasn't. So it was just like, you just realize, what a joke. What an absolute joke. I'm walking around thinking I'm in control. What a joke. I live at the mercy of God all the time. So this is our discrimination. He said once, when your discrimination is no longer tossed about by opinions, by passing fads, by passing ideas, by lesser realities, but abides unshaken in soul bliss. Wow, isn't that beautiful? Just even that phrase, abides unshaken in soul bliss. One phrase, you can just meditate on it forever. Even just to use the power of your imagination to project yourself into that reality. What would my life be like if I could abide unshaken in soul bliss? Aren't we lucky even to have these ideas to consider? We have very, very, very good karma. God bless you.